Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, dear online audience, my name is Niina Into and I'm more than happy to welcome you to this University of Helsinki Think Corner event, COVID-19 in Russian and Eurasian Societies. This event is organized by the Alexandria Institute, Finnish Center for Russian and Eastern European Studies. And then for those who do not know the institute yet, I would like to say that it is a research institute affiliated with the Faculty of Arts at the University of Helsinki. And our work is based on such fields of study as political, social and cultural studies, as well as history and other humanities. And today, for the next 1.5 hours, we're going to discuss a really topical question, that of COVID-19 and its impacts on the Russian society and also societies closely linked with Russia. And we have a lovely panel here of 3 Alexandria scholars, and the panel is going to be chaired by Dr. Mikhail Nakonechnyi, he himself a postdoctoral scholar at the Alexandria Institute Gulag Echoes project. But before I give the floor to Mikhail, I would like to encourage you all to actually take part in this conversation as well. I know we are here behind locked doors and you are out there somewhere, hopefully enjoying the lovely summer. But if you have a Twitter account, please send in your comments and questions using hashtag Corona in Russia. I will be checking my Twitter and keeping an eye on the hashtag, and I will then act as your voice here in Tiedekulma and deliver your questions to the panel. But now, Mikhail, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Niina. So I think that this is a very important event, and we have 3 wonderful scholars today to speak about really important topic, COVID-19 in Russia and Eurasia. So structurally, our first speaker, Margarita Zavadskaya, will set the context and speaking about the political background of the pandemic. And then Sherzod and Olga would focus on the most vulnerable minority groups in Russia. So this is the basic structure of the event. And I'm really pleased to give the floor to Margarita Zavadskaya, who is a political scientist at the with a PhD from a European university, and she is also a postdoctoral researcher at the Alexandria Institute, and she will talk about COVID-19 and the Russian politics. So, Margarita, you can have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Mikhail, thank you, Niina, and thanks everyone for having us here today. So it's a big pleasure to talk and to discuss what we've been observing for the last, I would say, 2 months, but for some of us it's even longer because the COVID-19 was spreading unevenly across different countries, and Russia does not belong to the first wave of those countries that actually had been affected by the pandemic. And just to give you a few numbers, so in case you're not familiar, Russia has the 2nd highest speed of the COVID-19 spread in the world now, scoring right after Brazil, so having about 8,500 infected every day. So, of course, Russia is a big country, but it's still, these numbers are quite impressive and ominous. So, and apparently, as most of you know, quite recently the Russian government decided to lift up most of the restrictions and basically has launched the preparation for the constitutional vote scheduled on the 1st of July. So, and all these actions actually provoked a lot of controversial reactions, as well as from the public, from the medical workers, and from the Russian voters in general. So, and what we're going to observe in the coming months is quite intriguing. On the one hand, and not that intriguing as maybe some of us may hope to observe. So let me just start with just a very basic things about what's going on in Russia, maybe what was going on in Russia before the outburst of the COVID, and actually what is particularly my take on what's going to happen to the Russian political support given all these controversial developments. First of all, what we know from the social research and from the social studies is that all kinds of natural disasters, external threats, usually provide the so-called rallying effect or uniting effect. People tend to unite in front of the something threatening and unknown. And in case of Russia, actually, this is not what has happened. So we do not really observe any rallying effect, as we actually, most of the, I guess, Kremlin workers hoped. And basically what we see, relying on the numbers provided by the state-sponsored pollsters and by the independent pollsters, is that it's either remained the same, the level of political support in Russia, or it even declined. As the Levada Center specialists argued, so even already in April and early May, if I'm not mistaken, you can see the number on the screen, reached the historical low of 59%. So. And according to the Russian standards of political support, usually, I would say, expressed for the president, it's pretty low. So one way or another, so what we observe is a decline in political support, despite whether we really trust these numbers or we don't really trust these numbers. So there is no rallying effect. That's one important thing. The second important thing to remember is the deteriorating state of the Russian economy. It's not the pandemic that actually is literally killing the economy right now. Russian economy has been experiencing crippling recessions even before that. For instance, due to the decrease in trade with China, so we already observed some, I would say, worrisome signals already in January and February. And basically, after the dramatic oil drop on the symbolic date, 8th of March, basically the Russian economy experienced the currency shock. So the ruble became very, very cheap. So all these developments affected the people's purchasing capacity quite dramatically. And what we know, it's, I would say, a bit of the opposite tendency. People tend to punish their government and their presidents for the deteriorating economy. So basically what we're dealing with now is the two countervailing, two fighting tendencies. On the other hand, the expected rallying effect in front of the common danger and, I would say, a deteriorating effect of the crippling economy. So that's basically the setup and what's going on in Russia nowadays. What is really specific about why what we can expect from the development of the Russian political regime and what we can expect in terms of people protesting and people expressing their discontent with the current policies. First of all, there is a kind of a consensus across the experts that the current measures, the current policies are actually fell short of the people's expectations, especially small business and vulnerable groups. And Olga and Sherzod will talk more about the prison population, people actually who are in jails right now, and even I think in a larger aspect. And Sherzod will talk about migrant workers. These groups of populations actually haven't been addressed at all by the government policies. However, some groups of populations, such as families with kids and such as those Russian citizens who got stuck abroad, they actually were entitled to some relatively small, moderate, I would say, allowances. However, most of these payments came with severe delay, with serious delays, and actually with a lot of red tape. Perhaps the numbers that are shown now on the screen still look quite high. But on the other hand, if you read through the interviews and through the people's opinions on social networks, you actually would see that people express a lot of discontent. And actually, most of the different groups of populations are unhappy with the current situation. Even those who actually were constitutive of the so-called pro-Putin loyal majority, those people who actually belong to the public sector, those people who were kind of, part of the so-called social contract. The state provide decent living standards, and people actually don't interfere with politics. So, and it seems that now the social contract is being has eroded, so to say. And actually, what is really new in this situation, so the last but not least, is the role of the small business. The small business was hit hardest by the crisis. The share of small business and middle-sized business in Russia is not that high. It's not that large. It's about 20% of the whole economy. But after the crisis, we expect that the development of the small business and those people who do not belong to either public sector or to, any other protected areas actually will be hit hard, and actually they will lose their hopes, and they are already quite disappointed by the current actions undertaken by the Russian government. This is something new which we hadn't really observed before. So speaking of what's going to happen with the Russian political regime and whether we should expect any protest activities or any, I would say, any turmoil, I wouldn't say so. I would be quite skeptical of that, because what is very specific of the Russian regime is that it's not an electoral democracy. So most of the people living under electoral democracies, they have, institutionalized channels to express their discontent. They can go to the polls, they can go to the vote, they can actually, how political scientists say, throw the rascals out. Russian citizens are basically deprived of this opportunity, because I think nobody has any illusions about that Russian elections do not provide any means of expressing any true preferences regarding the current developments and genuine support of political regime. So, however, it doesn't mean that people are happy. It means that people will find other ways of actually express their discontent, or they will actually accumulate these grievances throughout the time, throughout the I would say, maybe years to come or months to come. As to the constitutional vote, which is scheduled on the 1st of July, so I think this is the most hot topic, the hottest topic nowadays, and which is being discussed by most of the Russian observers and those who are interested in international relations and relations with Russia. So most observers agree on the fact that the president and the presidential administrations, they really wanted to hold this constitutional vote as soon as possible, because there are very grim prospects that the political support will remain as high as it is now, and it's not really high if we believe Levada Center, and even if we still believe the state-sponsored agencies such as FCIOM or FOM. So the level of support is about 67.5. For the Europeans, by the European standards, it sounds still quite decent, but by the Russian standards, compared to the previous rallying effect after the Crimean annexation 2014, it's about 20 percentage points less. So it's a dramatic drop. So basically, the prospects of the, I would say, political legitimacy and support in Russia are quite grim. But on the other hand, so it would be quite naive to expect any mass protest and any, I would say, public and immediate expression of discontent. Unfortunately, as we know from the social movement status, people do not protest when the economic times are really hard. So people actually tend to protest when all the grievances and when the hardest times actually had passed. So this is why we do not expect any political turmoil in the year to come, especially given the newly imposed restrictions by the Russian government on public gathering, on even one-person picketing. As for those of you who actually keep track on the Russian news, you know that the Russian journalist Ilya Azar was detained for 10 days, if I'm not mistaken, for one-person picketing in Moscow, and there were some other rallies which were and there was a breakdown of these rallies from the Russian police. So basically, all these new novelties in terms of how people should behave during the time. So COVID-19 basically opened up the new opportunities to restrain people's actions and actually to widen the toolkit of manipulations in terms of how people should behave and how they shouldn't behave. And basically, the number of channels to express this content has shrunk dramatically. This is not to say that people actually enjoyed plenty of such opportunities before that, but nowadays it got even worse. So, and to wrap up, the first take-home message maybe is that the Russian regime will remain roughly the same, but poorer and more repressive. And the second take-home message is that we should expect the gradual erosion of the pro-Putin's majority in the nearest future, after the pension reform and after the COVID-19, when people expected the state support the most, the state actually backed down from its own promises. So, and we should expect maybe some accumulation of grievances in the nearest future. And maybe that's it for me. And
thank you very much, Margarita. That was very thought-provoking. I'm happy to give the floor to Sherzod Eraliev. He's also a postdoctoral researcher at the Alexandria Institute, and he will speak about COVID-19 and Central Asian migrants in Russia. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. I'm really pleased to be here speaking about, with wonderful colleagues, speaking about the pandemic effects on Russia and Eurasia. I'll be today talking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Central Asian labor migrants and their remittance-dependent countries back in Central Asia. But before proceeding to any further, I would first like to give a very short background information about the migrant workers in Russia. As one of the largest destinations for migrants, Russia hosts around 10 million foreigners in the country, of which around, and these estimates, these are really estimates, not, there are no concrete statistical figures on this. So 6 to 8 million people are migrant workers. And these migrant workers' economic output is estimated to be around 10–11% of the Russian economy. While there are large numbers of Armenian, Azerbaijani, Moldovan, and Ukrainian migrant workers in Russia, we have in mind Central Asian migrants when we talk about migrants in Russia. So in this talk also, I will be focusing on Central Asian labor migrants in Russia. The vast majority of these migrants come from 3 countries of the region, from Uzbekistan with about more than 2 million people, and Tajikistan with more than 1 million people, and from Kyrgyzstan with around 700,000 people. Migrants from Central Asia can enter Russia legally and may easily become undocumented only after failing to get difficult to obtain documents in quite short time, patent or work permit being the most important one. So, and Central Asian migration in Russia is mostly male-dominated, and while male migrants are mostly employed in construction, transport, and agricultural sectors, female migrants find their jobs mostly in catering, trade, cleaning, and domestic services. A significant majority of migrants are seasonal workers. This means that a large number of them come to Russia in spring months when there is more economic activity in construction sites or in agriculture farms, and leave in late autumn months to come back again next year. So coming back to the pandemic, as the number of coronavirus infections soared up and the countries around the world started to take serious lockdown measures, Russia also followed the suit, which maybe happened a bit later than other people have expected. Anyways, and as of March the 18th, Russia announced a ban of entry to all foreigners that has lasted the whole summer, the whole spring, and it's still going on. And now we are in the middle of almost the middle of June, and the borders still remain closed. There are talks that Russia may be easing the border crossings, but it seems that will be mostly for medical treatments or very other important reasons. So we are not talking about the opening of borders for labor migrants in the coming months. And so while Russia announced the lockdown measures, Russia's local governors were given autonomy to define the level of strictness. And in Moscow, the largest destination for migrant workers, quite strict confinement measures were taken. This led to the closure of many businesses, especially in trade and service sectors. Most of these businesses had to suspend their activity. Although And Central Asian migrants were first in line to lose their jobs. Although Russian authorities advised against firing employees, advised companies and organizations against firing employees during the crisis, quite few businesses could afford to keep their Russian local staff on paid leave, let alone labor migrants. At best, the migrants could were sent to unpaid leave without any guarantee of returning to the same job if the work was to be resumed. And the severity of confinement also differed from region to region, and the scale of job losses also differed from sector to sector. And according to Russia's immigration rules, a migrant is bound to work in the same region where he obtained his work permit, patent. If, for example, if he or she loses a job in Moscow and finds another one in Moscow province, he or she has to start over the process of applying for a new patent work permit. This particular rule played a trick amidst the self-isolation lockdown measures. A large number of jobless migrants had to stay indoors in large cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, while in southern regions there was a growing demand for labor force as the spring opened spring opened season for agricultural works. And as I was saying, the loss of jobs differed from sectors to sectors. While most workers who were employed in service and trade sectors, they lost their jobs and thus their means to livelihoods. And others in construction sector, for example, had to resume their work after several weeks of confinement. I think this was partly due to the concerns expressed by big businesses over the potential deficit of cheap labor and suspension of big construction projects. But I think one of the most important factors in sending migrants back to work was the detection of 35 coronavirus infections in a dorm with 470 migrants locked indoors in Novosergeyevka in Leningrad Oblast. And this number actually in several days later peaked to 123. That's in one dormitory. And several mass outbreak of infections happened in other places like Murmansk with, I think, 68 cases, and Bashkortostan with several dozen cases again. And this, a couple of days later, Russian President Vladimir Putin urged local governors across Russia to let migrants go back to their jobs if they had one, and to resume, for example, the works at those places where certain measures of precaution could be taken. And on April the 18th, Russian president signed the decree allowing migrants to work without the work permits starting from March 15 to June 15. This was really a relief for many migrants who were running out of their means to pay for the work permits, which consists a considerable part of their earnings. And during the pandemic, labor migrants have become, as Margarita was mentioning earlier, one of the most vulnerable social groups. Many of them lost their jobs, and on the others in the country had to work in construction sites or in closed buildings, risking their health. And when they were diagnosed with coronavirus infections, quite many times they had quite minimal access to Russian healthcare services. And although the governments of Central Asian countries organized several chartered flights to evacuate migrants, and that I think in Uzbekistan's case it was more than 10,000 people were lifted with air flights since the beginning of the pandemic. But when we have in mind almost 2 million people, that's quite a small number, and there are tens of thousands of people who are in line who wish to go back to their home countries. And charity organizations and social activists, they were delivering food to those people who were totally left jobless, thus any means to feed themselves, let alone sending any remittances. And at first, many migrants had to borrow from their fellow migrants, and if it was possible at first, as the confinement measures, as the self-isolation, as the lockdown was still going on, less and less people had any opportunity to lend some money. So in those cases, it was the charity organizations and other activists, as well as embassies of Central Asian countries, who tried to help the minimum amount of people with food or other daily necessary items. And those migrants who still had kept their jobs, they had and had to commute to their job sites. They were often stopped by police for not only for ID checks, but also for checking their so-called travel permits in Moscow, where where one had to have a travel permit to commute in public transport. And rights activists have also reported that some migrants were accused by police, and they were the police has tried to extort money or accuse them of breaching the self-isolation rules. As it happened around the world, lockdown measures have led to the deep economic recession, and in Russia's case, as it was mentioned about the plummeting of oil prices that happened right before the pandemic, and the devaluation of the ruble exacerbated the economic crisis in Russia. So the things were already not very good for Russian economy, and the pandemic worsened the situation in Russia. And while officially registered people who are seeking jobs in end of May reached 2 million people, experts have estimated that the actual number of the unemployment is somewhere between 6 and 8 million people. That is 8 and 11% of the Russian labor workforce. And as a rule, the search for a scapegoat in times of crisis is a widespread phenomenon all over the world, and Russia is not an exception. And anti-migrant sentiments in Russia are based on the fears that migrants take away jobs from local people, they abuse or overload Russian medical and social services, they neglect the Russian culture or the rules that are accepted in the Russian society. And it seems the more and more Russians are losing their jobs. There will be more competition in the job market. This means that it is quite possible that xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiments of the population will be used by right-wing politicians, right-wing activists and groups. Moreover, not all of course, some Russian media have already started to paint labor migrants as potential criminals who are ready to grab food from local people, or who are just outside in the streets looking for any food to feed themselves. And while this may be true in particular cases, and we haven't much seen the evidence for these claims, but the general situation is a little bit different. And while the unemployment rates are growing following the pandemic, the economic crisis, now the Russian authorities are adopting new rules that secure the employment of priority employment of local people in the skilled jobs. Now, let me briefly talk about how all this situation affects the Central Asian countries. As we know, remittances are really important in Central Asia. The World Bank reported that globally, remittances will be cut by around 20% this year. That is about more than 100 billion US dollars. And in Central Asia, it seems that the job of losses and the loss of jobs and the reduction of earnings for many migrants have already led to the serious decrease in the amount of remittances. But already national economies of the Central Asian countries have already suffered from their own national lockdown measures, which led to the closure of business and other non-essential businesses. And the weakening of Russian economy, one of the largest, if not the largest, trade partner for Central Asian countries, poses a serious, and the reduction of remittances, of course, poses a serious threat to economies of Central Asian countries. In this regard, it seems the impact will be most felt in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the region's poorest countries. In 2018, remittances totaled the equivalent of 33% of GDP in Kyrgyzstan and 29% of GDP in Tajikistan. That is a lot for a remittance-dependent economy. And in total, for the 8 billion US dollars were sent in 2019 to Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. So and already in May, government organizations and media also have reported that remittances in April and in March and April of this year already fell by 50% compared to the same period of the previous year. So it seems this will be a quite difficult year for the region. And now the great majority of seasonal migrants across Central Asia, now they find themselves in a difficult situation. They can't find a job at home, and they can't travel to Russia to find a job. Even if it was possible, it would be quite difficult for them to find a job in Russia, given that Russian labor market already will have shrunk by the time when when they will be able to enter. And some people have claimed that Russia will still remain the main migration hub for Central Asia, and that is true because for many migrants, they will not have any other options. Of course, in recent years, other migration destinations like Turkey or the Gulf countries or East Asian countries there have been a growing number of Central Asian people, but that cannot be compared to the numbers in Russia. And however, unlike the crisis of 2008 and 9 or 2014 and 15, when Russia's economy suffered deeply from the sanctions, and the suddenly decreased number of migrants returned or was restored to almost previous scale within several years. And now it seems this pandemic, following this pandemic, it will take quite a longer time to the normalization of the situation. I think that would be the end of my talk, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or will be interested in participating in discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherzod, for elucidating this important subject. So our last speaker is Dr. Olga Zeveleva. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Cambridge and also a part of Gulag Echo's research project at the Aleksandria Institute, University of Helsinki. She will speak about prisons and punishment during the COVID pandemic in Russia. Olga, welcome. Yeah.
Thank you, Misha. Unfortunately, I don't have any good news, and I'll be continuing on the theme of economic strife that my colleagues here started. And I'd like to begin with a very simple idea about prisons. Prison health is public health. And that's what policy scholars have been arguing throughout the pandemic, and that's what sociologists of punishment have known all along. So separating prisoners from the rest of society or from other groups we've talked about, when we talk about social crises, is very short-sighted. It's also ethically problematic, and it's very dangerous for everybody involved. And if we don't find a way to address prisons as part of pandemic policy, then there will be many victims, both within prison walls and outside of them. So with this in mind, I'll turn to the coronavirus epidemic in Russian prisons. And while, of course, I fundamentally argue that prisons are part of society and not separate from it, at the same time, of course, prisons are peculiar spaces, quite shut off from the rest of the population, and crises play out in these spaces in very particular ways, and the current crisis is included in this. So I'll be talking about the Russian experience, and I'll connect Russian prison policies to trends in the rest of the world, especially in other European countries. First, I'll talk about how a pandemic can actually play out in a prison. Then I'll talk about the major prison policy trends around the world and how they compare to the Russian case. And third, I'll talk about some of the particular characteristics of the Russian case and what this tells us about control, punishment, and poverty in Russia. So to start, what do we know about coronavirus and how it acts once it hits a prison? Well, there's a plethora of studies about this based on previous epidemics like the TB epidemic in prisons and on the Spanish flu. And also based on some new findings from the corona epidemic, we know three things. If coronavirus enters prison walls, first, it spreads more rapidly than in the general population. Second, it results in more deaths than in the general population. And third, the prison will become a vector of transmission to communities outside prison walls. So here we really have to remember that prisoners are already marginalized, and they often represent the poorest and most disadvantaged parts of the population. And now they face exacerbated risks, and the communities around those prisoners, like their families, will be disproportionately affected by this crisis. So let's turn to prison policy in response to coronavirus. What have different countries actually been doing with their prison populations? Well, the most popular and quick response, arguably the easiest response, has been to close prisons to visitors. Russia has done this too. So a completely overwhelming number of countries in the world implemented some form of visitation limitations very, very quickly in response to the pandemic. And all European countries, for example, have banned prison visits at this point. Some of them are now slowly opening up prisons to visitors again. Russia is not doing this yet. So another emerging prison policy that's really been hitting headlines all over the world sort of looks like the opposite trend. Instead of closing prisons down to visitors and closing prisoners off from the rest of the world, countries have been releasing prisoners to avoid the spread of the pandemic, to avoid infection among vulnerable prisoners, and so on. So around the world, at least from what we know, 25 countries have done this, including Portugal, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Albania, Turkey, Belarus, Azerbaijan, and so on. So, of course, this trend can coexist with the trend of banning visits. And curiously and importantly, the trend doesn't really correlate with how democratic a regime can be. So many non-democratic countries are now releasing their prisoners, like Iran and Turkey. Russia, however, is not one of these countries, and there has not been either an early release policy or any kind of amnesty bill, even though Russia's very active human rights workers have been pushing for this amnesty bill for a while now, so far with no success. And even the annual amnesty, the Victory Day amnesty in Russia, has been canceled. So prisoners did not have that to look forward to as a mode of early release. So how have these policies and other policies played out for the prisoners themselves? Well, of course, it's difficult to tell. Prisons are closed-off institutions, but what we have been seeing on an unprecedented scale around the world is prison riots. And these have erupted all over the world, including in Russia. Our research group monitored prison riots between mid-March and mid-April. And over this month, just in 1 month, prison riots broke out across 36 countries. And in 15 of these countries, they resulted in death. Over 100 prisoners have died in these riots. And with very few exceptions, these were the prisoners themselves, so incarcerated people, not prison guards. Prisoners started rioting, demanding extra protection from the virus, increased sanitary measures, medical care, and of course, early release and amnesty. In Russia, a prison riot occurred in a penal colony in Angarsk in Siberia, and 1 person was left dead. So, from what we know now, which granted isn't very much information, this riot was not directly caused by coronavirus measures, and most likely it was caused initially by a power struggle between the prison administration and prisoners. It started with prison guards beating up a prisoner, then 20 prisoners slashed their wrists, and then in the violence that followed, as far as we know, about 300 people could have been injured. And again, 1 person was left dead. This was a huge event, and even though it wasn't directly caused by the virus, it laid bare some of the ways in which the Russian prison system is coping with the epidemic. So what I'll describe now are problems that I think are quite specific to the Russian case. And again, they concern both kind of the outcomes with what we saw happening in the aftermath of this riot, but also absolutely broader prison problems in the context of coronavirus. So first, and most importantly, there's just a lack of information about the situation in terms of official channels and official responses. Some NGOs have called this an outright information blockade, an information lockdown that's come with the coronavirus lockdown. We don't know about this riot, we don't know about other protests, we don't know about illnesses, how medical aid is taking place, or whether it's taking place efficiently and effectively in prison colonies in Russia. And we know very few statistics. According to official statistics, which are not released very often, 617 prison workers have been ill with the virus, and only 145 prisoners have it. But we have reason to believe that the actual rates may be much higher. Second, most of the information we do have, aside from these statistics, comes from prisoners themselves and their illegal cell phones. They reach out to relatives, they reach out to journalists, they reach out to NGO workers, and the prison services aren't commenting on these bits of information very much. So it's hard to verify the things that are coming from within the prison population. Of course, NGO workers, for example, suspect that the infection rates are much higher than is officially reported. Third, there's really a lack of physical access to the prisoners. There's a lack of access to the prison spaces, and the prisoners therefore are even more cut off, and I would say hyper-isolated from the rest of society and possible human rights help and legal help and so on. Human rights workers, lawyers, public monitoring bodies can't access the prisons because they're on lockdown. They can't check the safety precautions that are in place. They can't check the information that's coming out of the prisons. They can't check what happened with the effects of the riot or other protesting, and they can't monitor effectively violations of prisoners' rights. So fourth, there's this peculiar kind of measure in place where prison guards now work in shifts, spending up to 14 days just living in the workplace and sleeping there. And of course, this can exacerbate existing interpersonal conflicts between prisoners and guards. And again, in the context of very limited public oversight, this is potentially quite dangerous. And finally, there's the problem of continued mobility. Prisoners are being transferred from prison to prison. So for example, in the aftermath of this riot, 300 prisoners went somewhere, and for a long time, human rights workers didn't even know where they went, and the relatives weren't in contact with these people, and they were just being transferred, presumably, to other prisons in the region, maybe outside the region. Prisoners are still being released, which is another vector of mobility, and of course, mass transfer of prisoners within the penal system violates the very idea of prison lockdown to prevent infection spread. So, of course, many of these problems that I mentioned aren't new in any way. Riots take place, prisoners are punished, there are human rights violations, prisoners are transferred between institutions. But of course, the pandemic is exacerbating all of these pre-existing issues and making them far more dangerous. So this riot during a pandemic has turned out to be even more difficult to work with for human rights workers than a riot under normal circumstances, which of course is difficult in and of itself. And the information blockade has resulted in panic and suspicion and doubt about official statistics, official measures, and the safety of incarcerated people. The pandemic is also exacerbating existing inequalities in the prison. There was this idea at the beginning of coronavirus that it's a great equalizer and affects everybody in the same way. I think none of us would agree with this statement at all at this point. And I'll name just 5 categories of prisoners who face different kinds of problems due to their particular vulnerabilities. So first, you have, of course, older prisoners. This is clear. As we know, coronavirus affects older people. It's particularly dangerous to them. Second, we have people with longstanding illnesses. The prison population has a lot of TB infection. And often here, people who have longstanding illnesses rely on medical deliveries from their families or from NGO workers. And because of all the lockdowns, the postal restrictions, and so on, some of them haven't been able to have access to their medical deliveries from the outside. Third, again, women, for the same reason as I just mentioned, because of postal kind of disruptions, women have hampered access to sanitary products, for example. Fourth, you have the problems that practicing Muslims face. Because pork is given with some of the meals in some regions, Muslim prisoners often rely on family food deliveries for access to halal food. And again, they're cut off from this supply of food from their support circles. And finally, fifth, you have, of course, prisoners with families and children suffering from these severed contacts with their families because of the visitation bans. Now, I've talked at length at this point about what's happening within prison walls, but there are many things happening kind of at the border of the prison and outside the prison. So here I want to turn to former prisoners. Normal prisoner releases are still taking place in Russia, and we have to remember that prisoners are being released into a situation of lockdown. Of course, this varies from region to region, but in all regions, they face certain problems. Some of them are more immediate, and some of them are less immediate, like with the labor market we've talked about. So just to illustrate this point, I want to tell a short kind of experience of a man who was released just a couple of weeks ago. This man's sentence came to an end. He was released from a prison in Sverdlovsk region. And he was due to travel to his hometown, where he was supposed to check in with the police upon arrival and say, I'm here, this is my address, and so on. So he was let out, he was left at the train station, and he was unable to buy a ticket to his hometown, which was 2,000 kilometers away. And this was because the train schedules were limited due to the pandemic, and cross-regional mobility was quite limited, and he had to travel really across the country. So the travel schedule was extremely complicated. He found a way to go through Moscow. He had to spend the night at the train station. This was expensive. It extended his journey. The layovers were all very complicated. Finally, he got to his hometown, 2,000 kilometers away, and he was a day late to register with the police. So now he's facing charges for violating parole. Not only was he not tested during any of this for coronavirus, that's out of the question, he may also end up in jail again because of this violation. So to conclude, I'll leave you with this. Over 500,000 people in Russia are in prison right now. If you take a random sample of 1,000 people in the country, 4 of them will be behind bars. We don't know the extent to which coronavirus has ravaged this extremely vast prison population of Russia. And perhaps this will be a question for historians like my colleague Mikhail to follow up on. But we already know a few very worrying things. First, like in the case of the prison systems of many countries, prisoners are overwhelmingly poor people, which means coronavirus hits the country's needy populations the hardest. Second, there are many risk groups in prison: older people, people with pre-existing illnesses. Third, prisoners who are being let out are joining a Russia-wide web of mobility, potentially spreading infections and bringing it to particularly marginalized communities. And fourth, someone caught in the system of punishment runs the risk of being swept up by it again and again and again. The pandemic is making this really ever more likely, both physically, like in the case of the prisoner I described, and economically, as people experience shrinking employment opportunities and the economic effects of lockdown. And in this context, the prison system will sweep in as a means of controlling the poor, as incarceration rates are really known to go up when unemployment and poverty go up. So if we don't find a way to address both prisons as a part of pandemic policy and find ways of helping particularly marginalized populations, there will be many victims to come, both within and outside prison walls, in the short term and in the long term. So on that kind of really somber note, I'll hand it over to Misha again.
Thank you very much, Olga. That was very interesting and thought-provoking. So I would like to open the floor for the discussion. And so do we have any questions from the audience? Or okay. So maybe if participants want to share any comments or any additional remarks, no?
Just maybe, if I may enter, so in the roughly the same order we started. So, yeah. Thank you. So I hope that our talks were kind of mutually complementary, and we provided a more or less voluminous picture of what's going on now in Russia. So I think what is really interesting here is actually this constant search for scapegoats. Who is the guilty? And Russia is very well known for as a low trust society. So different groups of population don't trust each other, and Russian citizens tend to distrust Russian government as well. So taking apart the extraordinarily high presidential ratings. But I can comment on that later on if anyone is interested. Why is it the case, and our Russians are so irrational when it comes to political evaluations, given all the developments, worrisome developments we just discussed. So this constant search for scapegoating, for instance, the Moscow mayor Sergei Sobyanin blamed the reckless picnic and barbecue people in Moscow. That is because of them, actually, all the Muscovites are locked and trapped in their homes. It's not a medical situation. It's not a medical condition that actually causes people to be locked down. It's actually kind of a collective punishment for irresponsible behavior. And this kind of public discourse that is actually being spread by the state officials and mass media is also quite worrisome. And it also kind of, disunites people in front of the pretty dangerous and unknown disease, and this is something that really requires coordination, not only from the state part, but also among the population. And another example to bring here is the protest by COVID dissidents in Vladikavkaz, for instance. So those people utterly distrust the government and all the news and all the information that comes from the state channels. So the statistics that the COVID is real and that people really die. And if you read the interviews by medical workers, for instance, most of the people report that people behave irresponsibly, especially in Dagestan, when the situation is particularly dangerous. And if you're interested, I would strongly recommend some documentary by the so-called Redakция, but unfortunately it's in Russian, but it's quite informative. So they provide the information and the insights into how the situation is going on in Dagestan. So, and medical workers complain that people actually tend to, youngsters distrusting the news that the COVID is really dangerous. They visit their parents, grandparents, and we know that Dagestan is famous for its extended family system, structure of society. So people actually tend to celebrate weddings, having I think it's pretty much the same in most of the Central Asian countries. So it's very hard to convince people that this kind of social contacts are banned and the situation, the danger is real. So again, what I would really what I'm trying to emphasize is the lack of trust, as interpersonal as well as in institutional trust.
Could I ask a question to Margarita?
Absolutely.
So do you have any idea about how trust is trust levels are fluctuating in response to the pandemic between regional officials and federal officials? So is there any dynamic with people trusting the locals more or less, or the center more or less with regards to coronavirus?
This is an excellent question. This is something I should have mentioned almost in the very beginning of my talk. Indeed, so what has observed by the independent pollsters such as Levada Center I mentioned several times today, we really registered the rise in public support for the regional governors, which is not a common thing, which is not commonplace in Russia. So usually Russians tend to distrust almost everyone, but the president with some reservations. So indeed, this is the case that the popularity of local heads, municipal governments and regions actually started to grow. But this is not the result of the pandemic. This tendency we started to observe already in fall, if I'm not mistaken, of 2019. So there are some other developments that are being exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. So basically, I think it's not the case that COVID is bringing something drastically new to the Russian political arena. So this is something that really just sped up the already existing tendencies within the Russian society in terms of trust. I think some governors, if they're smart enough, given all the limitations, because they literally left to their own devices to cope with the crisis, right? They can even capitalize on that, on the pandemic, if it's possible. So I'm a bit skeptical about that, but we'll see.
Thank you. I have a question for Sherzod, actually.
Yes.
Many questions to both of you. I wanted to ask about how the process of deportation and detention of migrants has been functioning throughout the pandemic. Yes,
as I was saying, on April the 18th, Russian president signed a decree which exempted migrants from payments for their work permits, and this the same decree also for the time stopped the actual fines and deportations. So if a migrant was caught by police or stopped by police and he did not have a work permit at that time, he was exempt from any fine or deportation. That was according to the law, but in reality, I've been in touch with migrant activists, and we've seen many stories coming on media and social media that this in reality has not worked all the time. We've seen some scenes where, for example, there was a story of several women who were staying indoors in an apartment, and police came in and they took the women outside the streets, and they had to. They were first saying that, accusing women of not having the proper documents, and when they referred to this specific decree that exempts them from deportation or fines for not having the documents, and then the police said that since you are outside in the street, you are breaching the self-isolation rules. So, anyways, as according to these women, anyways, police have taken some of their money, and then only after that they have left. So. To make long story short, by law, by legal processes, they were exempt from deportation, and this didn't happen in deportation from the country didn't happen, but police, we know there's several cases when police have stopped the people. And I think there was also one specific case, but that Uzbekistan has brought back, I think, more than 100 people who were already in these pre-deportation centers. So the court decisions were made before the pandemic, and they were brought back in somewhere in mid-April.
So they were deported.
Well, yes, because the court decisions have already been made towards them before the pandemic. So they were already in the so-called TSUSIK, the centers for the temporary holding of foreign citizens who are about to be deported.
So what will happen now that once restrictions begin to be lifted and when this decree kind of runs out or ends, what will happen to the people who have kind of overstayed according to the old rules during the pandemic?
I think that's the question many, not only migrants, but also migrant lawyers are trying to find out. There are people really do not know what will happen since the borders remain closed. Maybe if that rule of extending the non-permit or grace period of until the 15th of June will be extended again, well, we shall see. If not, we don't really know what will happen. And I think the migrant rights activists are also trying to find out.
Thank you very much for the very prescient and thought-provoking remarks. So I give floor to Nina.
Okay, so now we do have 2 questions from the audience as well, which is really nice. The first one comes from, yes, this person behind a nickname that I can't pronounce. But anyway, here it goes. I would like to thank Sherzod Eraliev for his presentation about migrant situation in Russia. And I wonder how difficult it is for migrant workers to access Russian healthcare in COVID-19 times to get tested or treated.
Yes, okay, thank you. I haven't particularly touched this issue, thinking that it might take longer time since we have this question. Yes, I've been in touch with people in Russia who are monitoring the situation, and also, for example, people from Tangjahane Migrants Center or individual lawyers. They were speculating that when migrants themselves have concerns about their health condition, and they had doubts about the coronavirus status, when they were trying to call an ambulance or call the health services. In most of the cases, they were listening. They were not given proper. Let me put it this way. So, when a migrant calls ambulance, when medical personnel, in many cases, when they hear the people cannot speak proper Russian, or people, and they immediately ask about the citizenship. When they say, I'm a citizen of that country or another country, Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, in many cases they hang up the phone, or they will call back the rights activists, and then it would be their turn now to make sure that those people are also entitled to medical health care. In many cases, these calls were successful, and then people had to, medical personnel had to visit them. But we still hear many stories when, even if ambulance came and they just checked the temperature, and people had to insist on taking tests, and only after that they were they were given a chance to take tests. Yes.
Thank you. Didn't sound really that nice, but
well, that's
good to know.
Reality.
Yes, and the second question goes to Margarita. Just a moment. If I can find it now. Yes. Right. How have Russian government's policies toward COVID-19 situation been rated by population, and how long will this perception of government ineffectiveness or effectiveness stay in minds of constituents?
This is an excellent question. So, as many suspect, so there is again a lack of information, as Olga put it several times. So there is an overall concerns about all kinds of information that comes from Russia, and it also touches upon the public supports, how we measure it, and to what extent we can trust the numbers. So I've been working with surveys, and I was involved in many studies with that. So, unfortunately, you have to believe to trust me now, trust my word. So I have nothing to prove it, but I can. So giving you some references. But generally, so Russians don't tend to falsify their preferences when they respond to the questions whether they trust Putin or they trust the government. And even if we assume that there is some kind of a preference falsification, according to different estimates, it doesn't decrease 7% threshold. Of course, it's kind of it's a cumbersome procedure how we measure this preference falsification, and I'll have to go to another, at length to explain how we do that. But generally speaking, Russians are not that afraid to express their disagreement with policies. But I think the survey results is not the main and not the best source to keep track on these changes. I think what is more informative here is actually go through the so-called qualitative evidence and to see how actually what people say at the focus groups and what people actually say in public interviews. For instance, quite recently I've been reading people's medical workers' interviews, how they react to what's going on. Because medical workers, for instance, they were denied to any legitimate open channels to express their discontent, being under severe pressure from the hospital administrations, for instance. But they actually speak quite freely when it comes to, when they are invited by journalists or by researchers. So basically we can also they provide very similar evidence sharing their concerns about the situation and shortages in the hospitals, to give you the example. And going back to the question itself, it's hard to say for how long is it going to last, this, I would say, starting at the beginning of the distrust, mass distrust of Russians, and what the government says. And actually, to add more here is that the Russian government has never been very popular. Even after the Crimean annexation, actually, the government of the State Duma did not benefit from the rallying effect. Only the president actually reaped all the fruits of this geopolitical victory. And the government maybe just experienced a slight increase in the mass support, and then it went back to as low as around 30%, if I'm not mistaken. And it still remains quite low. So, and if I can make any forecast here, is this distrust will remain quite stable. And if we really want to predict any dramatic changes based on surveys, I think it's quite naive, because usually these changes happen, as passing tipping points. They happened, quite abruptly and unexpectedly. Otherwise, all of us would have, had instruments to predict social revolutions. But unfortunately, that's not really the case. So my take here is that we will observe accumulation of people's grievances, and nowadays we will have the kind of rejoinder of the former Putin's majority. So these people who actually were loyal to the president, to the government, and now they were left to their own devices in the hard times when they really hoped, they expected the state's help.
Thank you. I'll continue with another question for Margarita.
Okay.
Just take a breath.
That's fine.
Yeah. So how do you think, is there going to be a large voter turnout on the day of the forthcoming referendum?
This is the main intrigue. I think usually everything that actually deals with the presidential support requires a as high turnout as possible, because it has a large, huge symbolic value. When people turn out, it means that actually they bothered, coming to the polling station, and they kind of express their support. So this is why turnout is of utmost importance. But given the fact that this vote, I wouldn't call it a referendum, because legally speaking, it's not a referendum. This is just a legally unnecessary vote that had been planned and scheduled on 22nd of April, but due to the unexpected coronavirus outbreak, actually had to be postponed until the 1st of July. So as long as Putin and Kremlin, they already kind of messed up with this thing, and they already stepped on this road, they couldn't really backed up, on that. So they didn't give up the idea that the national vote is necessary for that. But now they're just trying to get away from murder, with diminishing the risks as much as possible. Speaking of the turnout here, I would expect the relatively high turnout, but again, here comes the question: will it be a real turnout, or it will be just a falsified turnout? Because Russian authorities nowadays have all the instruments to actually just to put any numbers they would love to see. So, but on the other hand, the Russian legislature allowed for facilitated the procedure of vote. For instance, now we have the postal voting system, which actually provoked a lot of debate. And plus, in big cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, people can vote electronically, so which may look as a progressive measure. But we also know that, based on the last year Moscow elections experience, that these elections can be rigged even more easily, as opposed to normal ones. So it's going to be less costly. So the numbers will be high. This is something I can guarantee. But whether these numbers are going to be real people, it's hard to know.
Right. Thank you, Rita. Now we still have like 15 minutes left, if you want to continue on your discussion, and I can still take a couple more questions from the audience if anyone wants to comment or question something. Just put on the Corona in Russia hashtag that you can hopefully see now on your screens as well. I'll give you a couple of more minutes. Okay.
So I just have a question to Sherzod and Olga. So what about you already mentioned inequalities, and that the most vulnerable groups, the poorest population actually was hit hardest by the crisis. What about gender inequality? How does the gender dimension play in terms of imprisonment population and migrant workers?
Yeah. You want to go first? Or?
Sure, I can go first. Well, first of all, there's gender inequality in how much attention there is to female incarcerated populations in Russia, and a lot of studies and a lot of news reports come from male prison colonies. This is partly because there are just so many more incarcerated men in Russia than women. However, Russia has one of the relatively higher rates of female incarceration as compared to other countries in the region. One of the things I mentioned is access to sanitary products. It's a very serious issue, and it's a very serious issue for women in the prison colonies, because while they are provided by the state with sanitary products for the menstrual cycle, it's usually not enough, and women trade them and rely on deliveries. And deliveries aren't happening because of postal kind of lockdown situations, and because sometimes the worker who's in charge of receiving deliveries at the prison isn't there, and then you have to wait a while for them to come, and because of the changed kind of work schedules in the prison colonies, everything that has to do with delivery is kind of slower and bulkier than normal. So that's one big issue. Another issue that has to do with kind of the future of prison populations in Russia is that a lot of women who are in prison for violent crime or murder are women who were protecting themselves from domestic violence. So Russia has incredibly high rates of gender-based violence in the home. As we know from all data that's been emerging from different countries, gender-based violence and domestic abuse has risen during lockdown, when people were locked into their homes, small spaces with abusive partners, abusive parents, for example. This has been a huge problem that's been unfolding behind closed doors. We don't even know the full extent of it. We don't know how it will play out in the future. But obviously, this kind of violence dimension has a lot of kind of gender-based implications, and women often end up in prison for protecting themselves, because the legislation doesn't do its job in protecting victims of domestic abuse in Russia. So those are two very different issues that I can name off the top of my head for gender differences in incarcerated and potentially incarcerated people.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of migrant women, first of all, about the numbers, as I was saying, the migration from Central Asia is mostly male-dominated, but that is mostly for about Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Kyrgyz migrants, about up to 40% of Kyrgyz migrants are female migrants, and this number stands somewhere between 15 and 20% for Uzbek and Tajik migrants. So that is, even given the large number of migrant population, that is still we have still a large female migrant population, and as the scale of loss of jobs varied from sector to sector, and most of the jobs that female migrants were employed in, trade, service, these are the businesses that had to close down during the lockdown. And as I was saying, most of the construction works resumed where male migrants are employed. So in this regard, again, women migrants became more vulnerable in terms of losing jobs, thus their livelihoods means to sustain themselves and sending remittances to their home families.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
It seems that we have no more questions from the audience.
All right.
So
Should be.
you can go to the conclusions.
Okay, so let me conclude this event. I think that it went really well. And thank you very much all for being so articulate and pregnant. I think that we've discussed quite a lot of vital and contentious issues surrounding COVID-19 in Russia. So I definitely would say that the event was a success. And so thank you very much all for participating and for asking questions and for being so involved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Nina.
Yes, thank
Thank
you
you,
all.
Nina.
It has been a very nice discussion, and I do hope that it will go on. Yes, it will have to go on someplace else since our time here is now almost up. And I will still take a few minutes to tell you something more about the Alexandria Institute. For this, what you saw here today is only a part of what we do at the Institute. We are a working community of around 50 scholars working on very diverse fields of study. And many of them have taken their time to use their expertise also to shed light on this topical issue of coronavirus. And I hope that you can find our website. It's at the University of Helsinki website, Alexandria Institute. Please check the website for more information or follow us in social media. And I do hope that you all have a nice summer and stay safe. And I wish to see you here in person as soon as possible too. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.